thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. It's particularly meaningful for Joanna and me to be able to speak in this venue about the remarkable life of Janina Mehlberg. She definitely qualifies to be ranked among the most amazing and inspiring heroines of World War II, and yet only now is her story being told for the first time. Now, I first learned of her story in 1989 when I gave an academic conference paper on Majdanek concentration camp. This was located in German-occupied Lublin, Poland during World War II. After the panel, a historian I didn't know handed me a carbon copy manuscript. He said it was the memoir of Janina Mehlberg, a Polish Jewish mathematician who helped prisoners at Majdanek by pretending to be a Polish Christian aristocrat. He said that Mehlberg had died in Chicago in 1969, and efforts to publish her memoir had failed. So he was going to be giving it to the archives of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. But he really wanted me to take this copy because I was writing about Majdanek, so he hoped that I could make the memoir story known. So I read this story and my jaw dropped and just kept dropping. Janina Mehlberg claimed that she survived the Holocaust in German-occupied Poland under the false identity of the Countess Suchodolska. She used this aristocratic disguise to become an official of a Polish relief organization that the Germans allowed to operate in Lublin, but only to aid non-Jewish Poles. Because she spoke flawless German, she had the job of negotiating with Nazi and SS officials in Lublin for measures to aid Poles. It seemed from her memoir that she was stubbornly persistent in her negotiations. She never took no as a final answer, and when she finally got to yes, she considered it an invitation to ask for more. At Majdanek, Janina Mehlberg claimed that she persistently nagged the SS to allow her organization to bring in ever greater quantities and types of supplies for thousands of prisoners. She even got permission to bring in decorated Christmas trees and Easter eggs. And she brought these deliveries herself inside the camp. So let me see if I can juggle all of this. You can see here, Majdanek had 5 prisoner compounds. They were called fields. Janina Mehlberg was able to bring her deliveries all the way inside the camp to the gate of each of these compounds. And there she could interact furtively with the prisoners who were unloading the deliveries. So she used those deliveries as cover to smuggle messages, supplies, even weapons to members of the resistance imprisoned in the camp. Because in addition to posing as a Polish official, she was also an officer in the home army of the Polish resistance. Now, I knew that Lublin was the headquarters of the largest murder operation of the Holocaust, Operation Reinhardt. The SS gassed most of its 1.7 million Jewish victims in the killing centers of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. But at least 63,000 Jews were murdered in Majdanek's gas chambers and shooting pits. Here you can see the compound that was marked Field 1 in the previous slide. And here is a U-shaped building. That's where the gas chambers were housed. So every time Janina Mehlberg brought her deliveries into the camp, she passed that building. And according to her memoir, she knew what was happening to Jews there. So this claim that she, as a Jewish woman, entered this den of mass murder almost daily and smuggled supplies to the resistance under the noses of the SS sounded to me almost too fantastic to be true. I couldn't use the memoir without first verifying it. And at the time, I had no way of doing so, particularly because I don't know Polish. So I figured that a historian with the right skills would find the memoir in the archives and do what was necessary to bring it to light. But then years, decades passed. I never forgot this incredible story because if it was true, it was important and needed to be told, and it weighed on me. Was that my responsibility? So in 2017, I was working at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, and I really began to dig into who this Janina Mehlberg was. All I had to go on to start with was the information provided by her husband, Henry Mehlberg, who was a philosopher of physics. He translated Janina's memoir from Polish into English after her death and added a preface to it, because in her memoir she doesn't identify herself. So based on this, I started out assuming that she was born Peppy Spinner in 1915. And I confirmed this, I thought, through her U.S. immigration records, which I was able to obtain. But then I came across 2 photos of Henry Mehlberg with his fellow philosophy students in 1925. A woman appears in each, identified in one as Peppy Spinner and in the other as Josephine Mehlberg. This clearly had to be Janina Mehlberg. And she clearly is not 10 years old, which she would have been if she'd been born in 1915. So with the help of 3 Polish scholars, I determined that she was born Peppy Spinner in 1905. So is this a reason to doubt the credibility of her memoir? But then I found a reference in a footnote to a 1975 book review that made me think that she probably was the Countess. And that's when I reached out to Joanna, whom I only knew by reputation as an expert on the Holocaust in Poland. And as soon as she read the memoir, she agreed to partner with me in investigating Janina's life. And very quickly, she found the definitive proof that Janina was the Countess.
This book is really a product of detective work to discover information about a woman whose survival depended on covering her tracks. And the first piece of evidence that confirmed that Janina Mehlberg was the Countess Suchodolska came from a Jewish archive in New York, that is the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. The archive has the collection of Hayas, which I'm sure some of you know. Hayas was established in the 19th century as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And after World War II, Hayas was actively helping Holocaust survivors emigrate from Europe. The Hayas files are generally closed to researchers, but the archivist recognized the importance of telling this story and of helping us verify, finding proof that we were the one that we were looking for. So the Hayas collection contains a file of about Henry Mehlberg, Janina's husband. And in that file, there is a collection of letters, exchange of letters that Henry wrote to various Jewish organizations to try to urge them to help Janina leave communist Poland. And of course, this file also contains the responses from those Jewish organizations. And you see here an example of this. So Henry was writing that his wife was still in Poland, but that there was a catch. She, in fact, was living there under an alias. So this really provided the evidence that we were looking for, and our research continued. The wartime archival records revealed that Janina's accomplishments were even more astonishing than what she claimed in her memoir. For example, here you can see a part of a report that Janina filed as Countess Suchodolska about her efforts in summer 1943 to win the release of thousands of Poles from the Majdanek concentration camp. The prisoners were peasants, Polish peasants, who were seized by the Germans in a brutal campaign. The SS quickly sent those whom they considered to be able-bodied for forced labor, but the children, those who were sick, infirm, women as well, those were basically dumped in the camp. And they were rapidly dying from the horrific conditions inside the camp. Janina won the release of nearly 4,000 of those prisoners. But in the end, only a little over 2,000 were released, and nearly 200 of them died within 2 days. Half of them were children. And Janina makes no mention of this in her memoir. And we believe that is because she did not see this as a success story. Why? Because she couldn't rescue all of those peasants, all of those 3,600 of them. Based on just wartime records, we documented that Janina negotiated the release from captivity of 9,700 Poles. And of course, it's impossible to estimate how many more of them survived thanks to her relief and resistance efforts. So we're talking about, Pepi Spinner, Countess Suchodolska, Janina Mehlberg, but who was this Countess Suchodolska before she assumed the false identity of a Polish aristocrat? Janina grew up in a small town in the multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual borderlands of what today is Ukraine and what used to be Poland between the two world wars. You see her hometown. It doesn't work from here. Can you see? Because I can't see from here. All right. So, and now I can see it works. Okay. So this is Żurawno. This is where she was from. Of course, the borders that you see here are contemporary borders. Janina's father was a wealthy landowner who mingled with the Polish nobility. And you're looking at Janina's picture, one of the earliest ones that we were able to find. And this kind of upbringing allowed Janina to absorb the languages, the customs, and the mannerisms of the upper classes. But Janina was also very gifted in math. In the 1920s, she obtained a master's degree in mathematics, studying under two of Europe's leading mathematicians at the time. And she obtained this degree at this prestigious university in Lviv, today Lviv, Ukraine. However, Janina found it almost impossible to obtain a PhD in math as a woman at the time. And so she studied instead with this charismatic professor, Kazimierz Twardowski, whom you see here on this photograph right in the middle with his students. He was a philosopher, but he accepted scientists and mathematicians among his students. He accepted women, and he accepted Jews. Janina obtained a PhD at the age of 22. And this was a major accomplishment that was documented in the Jewish newspaper of Lviv, and you see a clipping of that, and highlighted says Spinner Pepi from Żurawno, and that's that she obtained a PhD. Janina, after receiving this degree, studied at the Sorbonne in France for a year, and when she returned to Lviv, she assumed the more sophisticated sounding name Józefa. Janina and Henry married in 1933, and they both had teaching positions in Lviv, where they became part of the intellectual circles of the city. Janina's language skills, her ability to operate in a non-Jewish environment, her creativity, her intelligence, all that later helped her perform her false identity, survive, and fool the Germans. It was really by chance that Janina and Henry fled from Lviv to Lublin. In December 1941, the German authorities were establishing a ghetto in Lviv. At the last moment, as the Mehlbergs were weighing their options, staying in Lviv would mean going into the ghetto, but they had another option to consider, and that meant going to Henry's hometown where there was no ghetto yet. But at the last moment, they heard a knock on the door, and standing before them was Count Andrzej Skrzynski. And you see him in these two photographs, post-war photographs. On the left is he's getting married to his fourth wife after the war, and of course the photograph on the right is also a post-war photograph of him. And his mission, arriving in Lviv, was to help the Mehlbergs and smuggle them out to Lublin. Once they arrived in Lublin, Skrzynski gave the Mehlbergs the false identities of Count Piotr and Countess Janina Suchodolska. Clearly, Skrzynski was the Mehlbergs' rescuer, and he was also the one who enabled Janina to engage in her rescue, relief, and resistance efforts. After the war, Janina decided that it was still too dangerous for her to reveal her true identity in communist Poland. So she had another reinvention. As Dr. Janina Suchodolska, this time social worker, she became a leader in Poland's newly established Central Welfare Organization. What happened to Henry? Well, Henry returned to his pre-war identity, and he resumed his academic career. The photos that you're looking at here show a rare occasion when Janina, Henry, his two surviving brothers, and their wives were able to reunite after the war in Poland. But soon, the rising anti-Semitic tide in Poland and the violence convinced them that they had to leave the country. Before that happened, Janina, in her role as rising to the position of the deputy director of the welfare organization, she traveled around Poland and she witnessed the miserable situation of the Polish population. But of course, in her travels, she was able to also learn about the horrible situation and treatment of Jewish survivors in post-war Poland. And more than that, as part of a United Nations fellowship that she received, Janina traveled around the United States to learn about new approaches to child welfare. And you're looking at newspaper clippings that documented her visits in the US. While in the United States, Janina made contacts that helped Henry leave Poland. And he did that he left to Canada in 1949. Janina also left Poland, but she escaped from the country in 1950. She joined Henry in Canada, and here is another reinvention, as Dr. Josephine Janina Mehlberg, this time as a mathematician. The Mehlbergs lived in Canada for 6 years, and without family members or children of their own, they forged substitute families with their pre-war friends who were also Holocaust survivors and who settled in Canada. And you are looking at photographs of Janina and Henry with Gisela and Joseph Klinghoffer, who were very much involved in the Jewish communal life in Toronto. But Canada was not their final destination. In 1956, Janina and Henry emigrated to the United States, and they settled in Chicago. And each of them pursued academic paths. Henry became a professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago, and Janina became a professor, I emphasize that, of mathematics at the Illinois Institute of Technology. As you can imagine, this was an exceptional position for her as a woman and as an immigrant in a male-dominated field. And the photographs that you see here shows Janina in action, teaching a class at IIT. No one, except for her closest friends, who had been Holocaust survivors, knew the remarkable story that she put on paper.
So our plan originally, once we confirmed the memoir, was to publish it along with some text explaining its references and the context of the events. But the memoir only covers the wartime years, and as we found, only certain aspects of Janina's activities. Once we realized that the memoir doesn't do justice to what she accomplished in the war, and that her life was pretty remarkable before and after it, we realized we needed to write her biography. But of course, we had the advantage of this wonderful source, her memoir. And so we're able to tell much of her story from her perspective, incorporating her thoughts, observations, even the conversations that she recorded. There are many vivid and riveting scenes in the memoir, such as when she saved Henry from a mass shooting, and the 2 times she barely escaped being arrested by the Gestapo. I'm going to read a passage now that's based on her account of her and Henry's flight from Lwów to Lublin with Count Szczyński. Here you can see the route that they had to take. This was a very dangerous journey. They had to travel without any identity papers or the armband marking them as Jews, both of which were capital offenses. And this journey also turned out to be a transformational experience for Janina. After 3 days and 3 nights, they arrived at Lublin. Hoping to get out of the station quickly without encountering any police checks, the men went to retrieve the luggage while Janina sought a cab. She found one easily, then waited with increasing anxiety, straining for a sight of Henry and the Count, while the cab driver complained about losing other fares. Finally, nearly an hour later, she saw Count Szczyński approach. He was alone. "You and I are going home now," he said, taking her arm. "Henry was detained by some German police for something, and he'll come after us." Janina broke away from him and ran back into the station. There she saw Henry being berated by a German official who was shouting that taking any baggage out of Galicia was strictly prohibited. Henry looked pale. At any moment, the official would demand to see his papers. Janina sprang into action. "What do you want of my husband?" she demanded in German as she stepped in front of Henry and fixed the official with a haughty look. Startled by her peremptory tone and apparent lack of fear, the official lost his swagger and replied in a lower voice, "He has broken a strict regulation on baggage." "He could do no such thing," Janina retorted, "because when we left Lwów, there was no such regulation." The official backed down and said lamely, "Anyway, he has to pay a fine." If they agreed to the fine, Janina realized, they would have to show papers so it could be recorded. "We are not going to pay any fine," she declared firmly, "because there was no regulation about this, and if you will put through a call to Lwów, you will hear it for yourself." Now, flustered and fuming, the official ordered them to get out, "and don't let me catch you another time." Careful not to give away their relief, Janina and Henry sauntered out of the station with their 2 bags. Never did a harshly bellowed order sound so sweet, Janina thought. Decades later, she would reflect on the lesson she learned in this encounter, and that she would use again and again to save lives in the years that followed it. What do you do with your fear and trembling in a confrontation with a swaggering bully? You confine it to the small prison of the heart, letting none seep into the muscles of the eyes, hands, or legs. You quake within and show calm authority without. You pull off a hoax. You must not toady to them. You must not let them sniff blood. Composure and coolness toward them implied the backing of power. And in the face of power, they might very well shrink. 3 days earlier, Pepi Mehlberg had departed Lwów for Lublin. Countess Janina Suchodolska arrived in her place. Now, we found Janina's memoir inspiring not only because of the actions that she related, but also because of what it reveals about her character and her motivations. She was not fearless, as this passage I just read to you shows, but she was deeply compassionate and empathetic, and that's what drove her passion for saving lives. Henry wrote that Janina's actions were guided by a simple mathematical principle. One life has a lesser value than multiple lives, and her own life would have no value if she did not use it to save others. Henry also wrote that Janina's memoir was her testimony. It testifies not just to what she did and witnessed, but also to the lessons that she drew about human nature from observing it within the midst of the horrors of occupied Poland. She wrote very movingly about the terrible choices that the occupation forced people to make, as in this passage. What would a mother do in the face of the impossible choices put to her? There was one who, with her daughter, hid in the wardrobes of her apartment during a raid. They found her daughter, but not her. The child sobbed and screamed for her mother to save her. The mother kept silent and survived. I know this from the mother herself, who, sobbing out her story, wished herself dead instead of condemned to live with this memory. Another mother hid with her son in a bunker. Her son ventured out at the wrong time. He was seized and shot right there. The mother heard and remained silent. A young Jewish woman was offered the privilege of choosing whether her mother or her husband would be executed the next day. A father was offered his life on condition he stand and watch his son being hanged, and smiled all the while. If the smile left his face, he would be hanged too. He kept smiling. And who is to judge the impulse to survive? Now, years later, I try not to judge, but simply to report, since we who continue as members of the human race are obliged to know its capacities, however grim and unbearable the knowledge may be. But knowledge is not the same as enduring, and I'm not sure that knowledge alone gives us the right to judge. The mystery is too great how we respond to unbearable demands, because while physical and psychic tortures broke many, some reacted with what one can only call moral grandeur. I know some, and heard of many others, who helped their fellow sufferers at the cost of their own lives, who confessed to others' crimes, who willingly chose death over a degrading life. So the murder of goodness was not thorough, and this fact, too, must be reported. Janina wrote about people who were her enemies, who she knew were participating in horrific crimes, and yet who took risks to help her, even on occasion save her. And she also knew that some of those Poles who risked their lives alongside her, whom she rescued, who lit candles and said prayers for the safety of the Countess Suchodolska, would have despised her and maybe done worse if they had known that she was a Jew. Her specialty as a mathematician was probability, and she was continually calculating the odds for success of her actions and weighing whether the risks outweighed what was to be gained. And she found that she could not predict in any given situation whether a particular person would help or harm her based just on that person's ethnicity, religion, or ideology. She also came to understand that none of us is completely defined by either the worst or the best that we do. And so she decided for herself that she would not judge, but simply approach each person as a fellow member of what she called the vast suffering human family. And if they were suffering, then she thought it was her human duty to relieve that suffering.
Janina's memoir is an invaluable testimony of one woman's survival during the Holocaust. And from it, we learn how her rescue was arranged and how she, in turn, arranged the rescue of others. We learn about her motivations to endanger her life even more to help those whom she could, non-Jewish Poles. And only then did she reason that her life and survival have a purpose. Janina witnessed the beginning and the end of the largest mass murder operation of the Holocaust. But her memoir is also a testimony to the suffering and persecution of non-Jewish Poles under German occupation. The Nazis viewed Poles as subhuman enemies, and they planned to eliminate most of them after winning the war. The Germans pursued their anti-Polish policy with brutality and with determination. They destroyed and looted Polish national and cultural treasures. And here on this top right photograph, you see a toppled monument in Krakow and German officers standing above it. The Germans also shot members of the Polish intelligentsia. The photograph on the left shows a convoy of people being led to a mass murder. And they put millions of Poles for forced labor. And even more than that, the Germans conducted these bloody ethnic cleansing and reprisal campaigns. But Janina's memoir and her story does even more. She pays tribute to the Poles with whom she worked, to resist the German occupiers, and to help each other survive. And many of these people, even most of them, as we've discovered, were women. Our book also recounts the stories, the activities of the women who worked with Janina because we believe that they too deserve the recognition for their heroic efforts. And on this slide, you see some of the women that we mentioned. Antonina Grygova owned a bakery, and she made sure to provide enough food to then smuggle it to prisoners in Majdanek and even in other places. Irena Antoszewska was Janina's colleague in the main welfare council where Janina worked during the war. And Irena was actually, she led a unit that provided help to members of the Polish resistance imprisoned in Majdanek. Wanda Szupenko was a courier, but more than that, she analyzed messages from Majdanek to then pass it on to the intelligence unit of the Polish Home Army. Saturnina Malm was actually the first person who managed to establish contact with prisoners in Majdanek in 1942. And Stefania Peżanowska was a physician, a member of the Polish underground, who was arrested, brutally tortured by the Germans, and deported to Majdanek. And in the Majdanek camp, she established a women's infirmary. And interestingly, and we recount this in the book, Stefania Peżanowska was the one who met with Janina on Janina's first delivery of supplies to Majdanek. Barry and I are both professional Holocaust historians, and over the course of our respective work, we've read many testimonies, diaries, memoirs. We listened to oral histories of Holocaust survivors. And neither of us has ever encountered a story such as that of Janina. Janina's story is unique in that she was a Jew trying to survive under a false identity in occupied Poland, and she didn't lie low. Instead, she managed to rescue thousands of non-Jews, and more than that, she negotiated with top Nazis to enlarge the scope and scale of relief efforts. On this slide, you see the names of the German officials with whom she negotiated. You see their positions. Most of here we were able to find photographs of these Nazi officials. For some we couldn't. But Janina negotiated even with the manager of Operation Reinhard, Hermann Hoffel. So of course Janina's story is unique, But the story of every Holocaust victim is unique. Their stories reveal the terror, the horror, the suffering that Jews had to endure. But these stories also speak about family, about faith, about resistance, about resilience. And we need these stories to remind us of the common humanity with the 6 million Jewish victims. And we need them also to show us the danger that we all face when we fail to confront hate and protect the dignity of every human. It has taken 80 years for Janina's story to be known. How many other stories of Holocaust survivors await to be told? The world needs their stories. Thank you. So we are, of course, happy to answer any questions that you may have for us.
Yes.
So I'm sure we'll get much more after reading the book, but can you elaborate?
In terms of winning the release from captivity of Poles, that was through her negotiations. So she persuaded German officials to release them into the care of her organization. So she was really focusing on people who, she had a knack for framing her requests not as requests, but as measures that were so obviously in the interests of the Germans that they looked silly turning them down. So it was like, for feeding the prisoners at Majdanek, you need them to be able to perform forced labor for you, so let me help you do that. Or these prisoners are of no use to you, so let me take them off your hands. So that's how much of that worked. But she also, through the resistance, arranged for escapes of not from Majdanek, but of Poles who were being seized for forced labor and transported for forced labor. And also used her official ties to get to some of those released from forced labor as well.
Were these non-Jews as well then?
These were all non-Jews. They were all non-Jews. Yeah. Yeah.
Was she able? She wasn't able to get any Jews who were there out. I wouldn't think, but
No, she wouldn't be able to get them out. Yeah.
if they
And
were identified initially.
as Jews, no, she wouldn't be able to. Now, it is known that her organization, the RGO, did in some cases help Jews, and it's possible that she did, but she didn't write about it. So we think that she wrote her memoir for a Polish audience. She wrote it in the 1960s. We believe to counter, it was a big campaign of anti-Zionism being promoted by the Polish government, and along with that came a very anti-Semitic narrative of the Holocaust, where the Jews all went like sheep to the slaughter, and the Poles all heroically sought to save them, and now they're being repaid by the survivors with slander and ingratitude. And so she writes this memoir about a Jew who was a Polish patriot, who put her life on the line to save many, many Poles, and who was also very grateful to the Pole who saved her. So we think that that was part of her motivation. And so the memoir reveals almost nothing about her feelings as a Jew, seeing what was happening to Jews. I mean, she does mention what's happening. In particular, she was one of the first outsiders to learn about the shooting of 18,000 Jews at Majdanek on November 3rd, 1943. But you just don't get much of an indication from her of what she felt about that. In the back.
Sure. We started working together on this project in 2018, and the book was published in January 2024. But of course, we had to submit the manuscript before that, so that kind of gives you an idea of how we worked on this project. But we spent a lot of time trying to track down documents in 9 countries. I'm looking for confirmation, 9 countries, because at some point you lose track, in 9 countries. And these were a variety of documents, like regular, traditional historical documents that historians would look for about the main welfare council for which Janina worked. And we found a wealth of information there. But we also looked in post-war documents in Polish archives about Janina's activities after the war. We wanted to find out about that. We looked into Jewish archives. I mentioned one in New York, but another one, more than one, in Canada and elsewhere. And from these archives, from this information, we learned things that we didn't even expect to find. For example, how did Janina leave Poland? And there it was in a file from a Canadian Jewish archive that she escaped from Poland, found her way to Berlin, and the Canadian representation there already knew to assist her in her efforts to emigrate and reunite with Henry in Canada. And actually, our research continues. So a very exciting development that happened just in the past few days was that, of course, we're very much interested in Janina's story, in finding information about her pre-war life in particular, because we don't know as much as we would have wanted to know. So we received a message from a wonderful archivist at the Majdanek Museum and Archive, and she sent us 3 photographs from the immediate post-war period showing Janina in them. So, and we didn't know about them, and the archivist just happened to stumble on an envelope containing these 3 photographs. So of course, this gives us hope that there is more information to be learned about Janina.
But one of the big problems we faced was a lot of this research was done during COVID. So we were all set to go to Poland and Ukraine to do research in spring 2020. You know what happened with that. So we weren't able to get to Poland until May 2022, at which time we couldn't go to Ukraine because of the Russian invasion. And our our manuscript was due September 1st, 2022. So we really relied on the help of a lot of archivists, librarians, people at Jewish organizations. Everybody was so interested in the story that they were really willing to help us. So if you get the book, you will see we have a very long acknowledgement section. Yes, back, yeah.
I don't quite understand why she didn't.
Well, that was not uncommon for Holocaust survivors. I would say most Holocaust survivors did not talk about their experiences for some decades after the war. I know in my work at the Justice Department, and somebody's here who can back me up on this, when we would say if we were doing a concentration camp guard case and we would track down survivors at the camp and we would ask to interview them, often their children would ask to sit in on the interviews because their parents had never spoken about what had happened to them during the war. Right? We think she wrote it for a Polish audience, but she ran out of time, so we think she wrote it not long before she died. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think also in some ways she was trying to protect the people with whom she worked as part of the Polish resistance. I mean, even in the 1960s, Poland was still under communism. And so one reason why Janina did not come forward with her story to speak about it publicly was because she was trying to protect people in Poland. And the other reason may have been that her story was just so unbelievable. I mean, we listened to Barry in the beginning, right, when she talked about how her jaw was dropping and dropping when she was reading this. And as a historian, of course, you have to corroborate the information. And I think Janina also realized how incredible her story was.
Yes. So you had a question. Certainly one of them is what was the nature of the relationship between Szkiński and Janina. He was 20 years older than her, so I think too young to have been a close friend with her father, but you know, somewhere she was mixing with that nobility in the Żurawno area, and the Szkińskis did own estates there, so that connection happened probably in that area when she was growing up. Yeah.
And even Szkiński's granddaughter, with whom we connected, and here it is, you know, the wonders of social media. That's how we connected with the granddaughter. And she was just blown away by the story. She knew that her grandfather was part of this main welfare council during the war, but she had no idea that he saved 2 Jewish people. So that was news to her. And so even from her, we couldn't learn about the connection because she didn't know.
Yeah, and Szkiński was a real hero, and not just for that, but just the work that he did in the resistance and for the Polish Main Welfare Council. But it was called the RGO for its initials. The communists didn't like the RGO, and they were very suspicious of it, particularly because there were so many aristocrats who were running it. And they accused it of collaborating with the Germans. And so Szkiński in particular was accused of that and kind of left Lublin in disgrace. And the RGO was pretty much wiped out of Polish history in the immediate post-war period. That's one of our goals. Yes.
I have 2 questions. One was when I was looking at the map, Auschwitz was not in Poland.
And so this is an example of creativity, the creative ways to rescue people. And so Barry was before talking about the creativity that Janina used to kind of trick the Nazis into thinking that, you know, it was in their best interest to help these Polish people.
Yeah. So the Gestapo did suspect her not of being Jewish. I don't think anybody ever suspected her of being Jewish, but they did suspect her of resistance activities, and in particular, they set up one trap for her, which her co-workers actually prevented her from falling into it. But one of her co-workers was ran afoul of the Gestapo because of that, and he was tortured and murdered. Yeah. So on ingenuity, one of the things, when she finally got permission to bring in prepared soup for the prisoners, she had the soup cans fitted with false bottoms, and that's part of how she was able to smuggle supplies in. But she smuggled all kinds of things. She smuggled in books. She smuggled in a pneumothorax device. Yeah, and all different kinds of foods and medicines and medical equipment and textbooks for Dr. Pizhanowska. So, yeah, she was very inventive. It's interesting. Her dissertation was on mathematical reasoning and traditional logic, and she argued that mathematical reasoning can't rely only on traditional logic, but has to draw from other forms of thought as well, particularly imagination and intuition. And we feel that she used all 3 during the war. Well, I was a German historian. I got a PhD in modern European history, specializing in German history. And I wrote a dissertation on a military topic, German influence in the Argentine army. And then the Office of Special Investigations was looking for another historian, and they liked the fact that I knew about German military organization and terminology. I had done research in some of the same archives that they used, and I could read old German handwriting. None of those I ever thought would be employable skills.
And for me, of course, family history plays a role in my interest in the Holocaust, of course. But I was also interested in these questions of why people do certain things and what are the context of their decisions. And because I was so interested in the Holocaust, I pursued a PhD specifically in Holocaust history from Clark University, the only university still at the time that was offering such a degree. And since then, I was teaching and decided to work for a Jewish nonprofit, which is the Claims Conference, and its mission of securing compensation for Jewish Holocaust survivors and advancing research, education, and documentation about the Holocaust.
Were your parents Holocaust survivors?
Good question. So you know how Barry said she does not know Polish, and that's why she was looking for someone to cooperate. Well, it so happens that I do speak Polish. I am Polish. My background is I'm originally from Polish. That's where I was born. So you can tell, like, by the way I pronounce things sometimes, right? Yes. Okay. Yes. So that's my background.
And I'm from Norfolk, Virginia. But that experience is relevant in that growing up in the segregated South, thanks to my parents, I was struggling from the age of 10 with this question for me of why people I knew who considered themselves good Christians and patriotic Americans were going along with a system that clearly was contrary to their supposed values. So I think that's part of when I became really fascinated with European history and languages in college, and what really drew me to German history was that experience, because Germany in the first half of the 20th century is kind of the ultimate example of that, human question. This is a question we get asked every time we do a program, is when is the movie coming out? So I don't know, there's someone here who might have a better answer than
But I just want to add that it is extremely important for us to keep sharing Janina's story and to honor her memory, and what she did during the war. Because like Barry said, she had no descendants. There was no one to carry this story. And what she did during the war and how exceptional she was, that was unknown. So it's really, this is our goal. And this was our goal in joining forces and in writing this book, to make sure that we honor her.
Okay, I think we should let you go. So.